Somewhere in a filing cabinet, there's a case file with your name on the cover. Not because you did anything wrong, just because someone, somewhere, decided your life was worth documenting. Most people never think about that, but detectives do. It's their entire job to look at a life from the outside and find the one detail that explains everything. Which is why it's strange when the detective becomes the mystery. This happens more often than you'd expect. Not in fiction, in real closed case files, in retirement announcements that were never followed by an actual retirement, in officers who solved the one case that made their career and then simply stopped showing up anywhere afterward. You'd think solving a case would be the end of the story. For the detective, it should be. The file closes, the suspect is found, the paperwork gets signed. Life continues. But there's a pattern researchers who study high-stress professions have documented for decades, and it isn't about the crime at all. It's about what happens to the person who solves it. Psychologists call it secondary traumatic stress, sometimes described as the cost of caring. It's what happens to someone who spends months, sometimes years, absorbing the details of someone else's worst day, interviewing witnesses, reading autopsy reports.
Standing in rooms where something terrible happened and having to notice everything, because noticing is the job. Most people are protected from that kind of exposure by simply not being there. Detectives don't get that protection. They walk directly into it, over and over, and are expected to walk back out unaffected. Except, not everyone walks back out the same person who walked in. There are documented cases of investigators requesting reassignment immediately after closing a major case, even after being publicly praised for the work. Some transfer to smaller departments in smaller towns. Some leave law enforcement entirely and refuse interviews about the case for the rest of their lives. And in a handful of well-documented cases, investigators have disappeared from public life so completely that journalists trying to follow up years later couldn't locate them at all. Why would someone walk away from the case that made them? Maybe because solving it required knowing something they can't unknow. A good detective doesn't just gather facts. They have to think the way the person they're chasing thinks. They have to sit with a version of a stranger's mind long enough to predict its next move. Forensic psychologists who study criminal profiling describe this as a kind of forced intimacy. You don't choose to understand a dangerous person. The case forces it on you, piece by piece, until you can predict them better than people who love them can. And once you can think like that, it doesn't switch off just because the file closes.
There's a well-known account from criminal profiling history describing an investigator who helped develop early methods for understanding violent offenders, and who later described the process as leaving something behind in every case he worked. Not evidence, something personal, a piece of attention that never came back. Multiply that by dozens of cases over a career, and you start to understand why some detectives don't retire quietly into golf and grandchildren. Some retire into silence. Some retire into moving somewhere nobody knows their name. Some just stop being reachable, and their old departments learn not to ask too many questions about where they went. Here's the detail that makes this stranger than ordinary burnout. In several documented instances, it wasn't the worst case of an investigator's career that triggered a disappearance from public life. It was the case they were proudest of solving. The clean one. The one with a conviction.
A confession. A family who finally got answers. You'd expect that case to be the good memory, the one they'd talk about for the rest of their career. Instead, some of them go quiet immediately after. One theory researchers have proposed is that closure for the public and closure for the investigator are not the same thing. The public gets an answer and moves on. The investigator gets the answer and then has to live with everything they learned to get it, none of which makes it into the official report. The parts of a case that never become evidence, The small human details that don't matter legally, but change how a person sees the world afterward. Those don't go away when the file closes. They just stop having anywhere to go.
So the detective disappears, not from a crime, from the accumulated weight of understanding one. You've probably driven past a retired detective without knowing it. Someone quiet, careful, a little too observant in a grocery store line, watching exits without meaning to, noticing which cars are parked too long outside a house that isn't theirs. Old habits from a job they supposedly left behind. Some of them will tell you they miss it. Most of them won't talk about it at all. And if you ever do meet one, and you ask what the hardest case was, watch their face before they answer. Sometimes the pause tells you more than anything they end up saying. Because somewhere in a filing cabinet, there's still a case file with someone's name on the cover. The case is closed. The detective who closed it is not always where anyone expects them to be. And the next time you notice someone standing a little too still at the edge of a room, quietly reading everyone in it without seeming to try, you might be looking at someone who used to have your job title, but never really clocked out.